cannabis can be an incredibly useful tool for easing anxiety. It can be a very useful tool for slowing racing thoughts.
Welcome to Living in the Weeds, a series that explores the lived experiences of neurodivergent people who consume cannabis, with your hosts, Jessica of Jessica Riley Writer and Lucy of Lucy's Natural Remedies. Today's guest is Cate Osborn. Cate is a neurodivergence educator and is better known as Catieosaurus on all parts of the internet.
What is so interesting to me is that I don't want to say all of them because some of them don't, but in the majority of studies, when they're talking about cannabis, they talk about cannabis as this sort of united front. Like there is one, it's like it's just Papa John's. There's only Papa John's pizza, and that's it. When it's like, no, there's a lot of different places where you can get pizza in this world, and they're all going to be different in slightly varied ways, and are probably much better than shitty ass Papa John's pizza anyway, right? And so like I'm wondering if you can tell me more about that. Because the thing that I find so frustrating is like if you look at the research, it's like, cannabis is not good for ADHD. That's sort of the consensus. But it's like, is it? Or did you look at one specific type of thing and with like a very small group of people and then therefore determine? And I just wonder if you know more about that, because I don't know as much as you know.
I mean, you get into the limitations on these scientific studies. That is one of the biggest barriers to cannabis research and neurodivergent people, because neurodivergence is almost never accounted for in these studies. And so many of these studies are retroactive. They're surveys. They're pooling men who sit at their computers and smoke joints during the day. So you're not accounting for the THC percentage. You're not accounting for whether it was sun-grown or outdoor grown, which studies are showing there's a really big difference in the minor cannabinoid profile and the terpene profile in between sun-grown and indoor grown. And that sun-grown, because it has more balance of these minor cannabinoids, because it has more terpenes, is better for people, because indoor grown has a really big focus on THC, on Papa John's, on just getting this one thing, which is actually, it's like ripping shots all day. It's not necessarily the most medicinal benefit of cannabis. And it's really hard to dig into these nuances because people want to treat it like marijuana, like THC is all that you get from this plant, and it's not true. And the limitations on these studies is that so many of the scientists don't fully understand the cannabis plant itself and what they're studying. They're just looking at this 20,000 foot view through the lens of THC is bad. It gives people with ADHD cannabis use disorder. And it's not looking at the benefits people are getting or what they're consuming or if they're over consuming or if they're titrating their doses. It's so nuanced, it's so complex, and it's not something that we are really good at talking about or studying yet. And that's my rant.
I would listen to you for 5 hours. I want you to know. I'm just sitting here. I'm like, yes, more science, please. Thank you, Jess. But yeah. And so like, that's the thing that I get frustrated about, is because my job, the thing that I do for my career, is I educate about neurodivergence. But oftentimes looking at the official, I say in quotes, official science is so, it is so myopic. It is so focused on this like Nancy Reagan era, drugs are bad and K, like, and so it's just like one of those things where I feel like the narrative around cannabis has been so stigmatized that it's really difficult to have these conversations. And then I also feel like in this moment it's really important to acknowledge our privilege in being able to have these conversations, because there are a lot of people who can't because they're in jail for things that are now legal, Yeah. And so yeah, like it's so frustrating to me as a neurodivergent educator to have to sort of wade through that stigma and wade through that miseducation to get to like, no, but actually like there's a difference between sun grown and inside the room grown. That's the term that I learned just now.
For me, I noticed cannabis was really interfering with my ADHD and my perception in life because of this focus on THC, right? It's really hard now to go to the dispensaries and find anything lower than like 22% THC. Yeah. And like growing up, it was 12, 15%. And And that's on the low end, the 22%, right? There's some that it's an average of 27, 26%. And even though it seems like a small incremental dose, it impacts you so much more. And what I was explaining to people was like, look, I've always, they called me chimney in college. Like, I've always been the smoker, and I was used to being able to sit down and rips, my bong, take, a couple of puffs from the joint, and it wasn't detrimental to me. I was still able to function.
Yeah.
And it was like somebody had taken my beer and replaced it with Everclear, and I was none the wiser, right?
Yeah.
So it's really, it's frustrating, especially when you have lived experiences of seeing how these minor cannabinoids like CBG have really helped enhance your quality of life and not see it be studied at all by people. And it's like, let's not focus so much on THC.
Yeah. And I think that's part of it too. I mean, it's just that it's like there are so many different options. Like, I know a lot of people with ADHD who have had incredible experiences with like CBD. Like, it just works for them, works really well, like gives them like just exactly what they're looking for in terms of being able to sort of like manage their symptoms. But then it's again, it's like, but where are the studies, And so like it puts, and not that I have the hardest life in the whole world, but it puts me in a weird position as an educator, because like I can't really be like, well, I have a good time with it, so like Catieosaurus stamp of approval, kids. But and so it's like frustrating watching that lack of research really. I mean, I'm going to use this word. I really do think it harms more than it helps, because there is such like, again, like it just comes back to that stigma and that lack of education, where I really think a lot of neurodivergent people could benefit from things like CBD, CBG, and like, yes, maybe THC. But there's so much that we just don't know. And we see it even more with things like, microdosing, like mushrooms. Like, there's just so much studies being done about that too now, where it's just like, there's a lot of stuff that is probably really going to support and help neurodivergent people that has just been stigmatized for so long that we're sort of just waiting for those, like the scientific and medical community to sort of keep up with like the sort of, personal experience, I guess.
Yeah, no, the lack of research is really harming a lot of people, and it's frustrating. And that's not to say that, pharmaceuticals are bad. They're amazing. That, as you said, they are life-saving and life-changing for people. But when you turn towards these other minor cannabinoids and you're like, wait a second.
Yeah. Well, and we also see like pharmaceutical use being supported by things like cannabis, where a lot of people get frustrated with things like the anxiety or the sort of like racing thoughts that come from, stimulant medication. And it's like, I might need that stimulant medication to get through the day, but there's a way to like balance those sort of negative experiences as well that often come from things like plant medicine. And again, that's when we get into that uncomfortable conversation of like, a lot of people do that in the ADHD community, but science is still going, yeah, but
yeah.
And so, yeah, I just get so frustrated with that, because I think that there's a lot of good that can come from using things like plant medication safely and moderately and educatedly, which is not a word, but I'm saying it is now. That is just, yeah. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, no, definitely. And like,
I think what you guys were saying about the difference in percentages too in these THC, we can't ignore that, because cannabis has been medicine for thousands of years. People have been pressing the seeds and eating the oils. They've been inhaling the fumes. They've been making tinctures. This is something that our ancestors were using, but they were using it in a low THC, high minor cannabinoid profile setting. They were using this sun-grown cannabis that, connoisseurs look down and they're like, oh, that looks like trash. Who would smoke that? Well, it's balanced. It creates a balanced high. It creates a balance in the body. You're naturally stimulating your endocannabinoid system, which we know in people who have neurodivergence is often dysregulated and underperforming. So you're giving your body these cannabinoids, these chemical compounds that it's missing, and it's supplementing it in a way that single molecule pharmaceuticals are not able to replicate.
I want to know more about how that has come about. Like, why has this, and this is just me genuinely not knowing things and I'm interested now. But so why has the focus become so much more on a higher THC percentage as opposed to like finding like a really good balance in products coming out?
I mean, there's a lot of different answers to that, but I think the consensus is typically prohibition. When you weren't able to get cannabis whenever you wanted it, you wanted to know what you were going to get was going to give you something that you could feel. Because you hand somebody a CBD joint, they're going to be like, I don't feel anything. Did I even really smoke anything?
Yeah.
So when you can only get it once a week in, half-ounce sizes, you want to know that this is going to do it. And then from a plant perspective, let me back up here. Molecules like THC are secondary metabolites in the cannabis plant, which means they're not necessary for the plant to live and survive, but they're helpful for things like reproduction and warding off insects and etc. And this trichome production is very noticeable. It's what gives you these like resinous, shiny nugs. And people are really enticed by these nugs. And they think that the shinier the nug is, the better the high will be. When in actuality, what it's come to is those shiny nugs are almost entirely composed of THC. And it's a really imbalanced high that's going to make you really anxious and make you want to take a nap to not deal with it. So I think in short, we have prohibition to thank for that, because we weren't able to focus on the complexity of this plant. We had to pick something and run with it.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Think about it. When you go to California, you go to the store and you're like, give me something that's going to work, right? Like so many people, when they come into the dispensary in DC, we had a lot of, out-of-state tourists and whatnot. They're like, what has the highest level of THC? And I'm like, no, wait, what are you trying to do? If you're trying to go to the museum and retain any of that information that you're reading, you're not going to want the highest level THC here. If you're trying to knock yourself out and ignore the fact that you're our nation's capital, sure, here. No, but it's very true. And like I remember seeing that and they're like, oh, it's got shiny nugs on it. It's crystally. It's sticky, right? That's sticky icky. That's where those trichomes come from, right? Like, or the stickiness comes from those trichomes. And I really just think that it's people looking for that supreme utter high and a lack of education, right?
Yeah.
Not understanding that you can get that happy feeling without having to flood your endocannabinoid system with so much THC, right? Like there's so many other ways for you to be able to achieve your goals. So like, and it's a shame, honestly. Like it gets to the point where you're like, okay, you know, home grow has to be part of the laws, because these growers that are out here, the cultivators, aren't really keeping the patients in mind. They're thinking about the bottom line instead, right? Because you'll see it in the menus. Like I coach people on how to use which cannabinoids and how to use cannabis mindfully, right? And looking at the menus for them, and it's really frustrating because it keeps continuing to get worse and worse, like higher THC, or all of a sudden one terpene becomes extremely popular and it's like 80% of that menu is limonene. And I'm like, okay, this is not going to work for this person, right?
Yeah.
But if you start educating people and start teaching them and say, hey, you know, it's like strain names come and go, terpenes are forever. Things like that will help, I think, create a little bit more diversity in our medicine and be able to come back down. I think also, and I don't know if you've ever dabbed or done any of those concentrates or not, but those have, 80 to 90% THC in there. And I think that fix, that quick instant high, can be kind of addicting in a sense, right? That easy to go and get it kind of thing. They're extremely tasteful at the same time. Like the flavors that you get from it are just so amazing. You don't have that ashiness from smoking, but it leaves your endocannabinoid system kind of jolted, right?
Yeah,
It leaves you at a higher need. And so it's a kind of a self-perpetuating cycle at that point.
Yeah. And I think too, like, Jess, you mentioned like cannabis use disorder earlier, and I think too like that's also something to keep in mind, especially when we're talking about like ADHD, because ADHD impulse control is something that can really start sort of like piling on. Like you can be using, cannabis THC like totally within moderation, right? Like you can be being totally reasonable, nothing unhealthy about it at all. And what can actually wind up happening is something called utilization behavior, which is where it's basically I see it, I do it is the short answer of that. And so keeping things like vape pens around, like I had to stop keeping a vape pen in my office because I would just be sitting there and go, oh, vape pen, vape. And then I was like, I have a podcast interview in an hour. Oh no. And so things like that too, right? Where it's like when we're talking about these really high concentrations of THC or, just like these really sort of powerful blends, it's important to also know that there are components of certain neurodivergencies that may not work really well with those things, just in terms of that like immediate impulse or, wanting that like dopamine hit or whatever it may be. And I just think that's really interesting too.
Yeah.
I don't know where I was going with that, but it's
Well, it is interesting because I think people who have ADHD tend to be, or at least historically have been labeled more as cannabis use disorder because of that self-medication aspect.
yeah,
But there is a modicum of that self-medication that you need control over because THC is not what we would clinically consider addicting, but it is habit forming. You can
yes,
train your brain to want that rush of euphoria, that mood stabilization, that happiness. So treating it like a medicine, utilizing these minor cannabinoids, finding a blend or a dosage of like 40% CBD, 20% CBG, 40% THC. I had to do the math there for a second. And finding that blend that is medicinal to you, or understanding like, hey, I love THC and I can't smoke during the day. And that's what it means for me to use cannabis medicinally.
Mhm.
Understanding yourself, your limits, your neurodivergency quirks, and your endocannabinoid system is a huge ask for cannabis users. But your life will be infinitely better when you get on the other side of that.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And I also think too, just because I feel like this is something that needs to get said, is that when we talk about neurodivergency, there's a tendency, especially because I think of the popularity of some of these conversations online, that neurodivergency is sort of code for ADHD and or autism, and that's it. But in reality, neurodivergency is a wide umbrella of different things that go, run the range of things from like ADHD and autism to things like bipolar, schizophrenia, even Down syndrome is part of the neurodivergent umbrella. And so making yourself aware, knowing that kind of thing and like how your executive functioning deficits and just other symptomologies or just different things that might come with your personal neurodivergence, that's really, really important because, two people with, different neurodivergencies using the same strain could have very different and very damaging effects depending on what particular issues they're struggling with. And I always like to say that because sometimes I just talk about ADHD the whole time and I'm like, no, I should talk about these other things too.
Yeah, and it's important because we see these fear-mongering headlines, weed induces psychosis. And what they're really getting at there is high-potency THC products can induce psychosis in people with genetic predispositions towards neurodivergencies like schizophrenia. And so if you have that genetic predisposition, yeah, dabs can be really dangerous for you.
Yeah.
It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would love to hear your thoughts, Katie, on rejection sensitivity dysphoria and how cannabis can help people sit with that and address that internally.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So rejection sensitivity or rejection sensitivity dysphoria, depending on your school of naming, is something that affects a huge percentage of neurodivergent people, especially neurodivergent people with ADHD. And some studies say that up to 97% of people with ADHD have rejection sensitivity. But the thing that I like to say, and I like to be very clear about, is that as of right now, as of 2023, rejection sensitivity is not a diagnosable thing. Rather, rejection sensitivity is sort of a colloquial term that we use to talk about the experience and the collective trauma of growing up neurodivergent. And what that means is that as we are growing up, as we are learning more about ourselves, as we are figuring out how to navigate the world, we are told, neurodivergent people are told over and over and over that we are wrong, that there's something like we're doing it wrong, we're doing it bad. And we start to notice that, we start to pick up on that, and we start to sort of pattern match patterns where there are none. So similarly, like if you go to the doctor and you say, hey, I have a runny nose and a sore throat and a fever and the chills, the doctor might say, yeah, you have the flu. Rejection sensitivity is sort of a collection of those trauma symptoms showing up in our lives. And what that looks like is a profound and very, very real, and this is important, a very, very real reaction to rejection that is real or rejection that is perceived. And that's really important to keep in mind. Because for a lot of people who don't understand rejection sensitivity, I'm sorry I'm ranting, but this is like one of my like soapboxes.
I asked.
No, I love it. So it's fun.
But like looking at somebody who, if you know somebody with rejection sensitivity, which spoilers, if you know somebody with ADHD, you probably do. It might make zero sense to you why that person might get a text message that ends with a period instead of an exclamation point. And then they spiral for the next 2 days about whether or not this person is mad at them. But that is not an exaggeration, like that is the extent to which rejection sensitivity can come into play. So then the question I always get is, okay, I have that. I do worry about rejection. I do constantly have anxiety surrounding, like my friends and my job and all of these different things. So what do I do about it? And for some people, the very real sort of solution has been smoke weed every day, which I love. I love that for them. Because joking aside, cannabis can be an incredibly useful tool for easing anxiety. It can be a very useful tool for slowing racing thoughts. It can also be a tool, and other plant-based medicines as well, can be a very useful tool for internal examination and reflection. Because that can be something that is very, very hard for a neurodivergent brain to sit with, because often we are in our brains so often that taking that moment to say, okay, I'm going to step out of that and step into a place of reflection and a place of, sort of like working through this can be very difficult, because that requires slowing down and intentionality. And so something that we see a lot with self-reported cannabis use in folks with ADHD is that slowing down effect, that sort of slowing of the thoughts, that easing of anxiety, that improving of sort of like social, like relational techniques. All of those can come from appropriate, again, I always feel like I have to like asterisk, but appropriate and intentional use of cannabis and CBG especially too, is I've heard really good things about that. But yeah, it's about, I think it's a combination of slowing down and really reflecting on, is this real? Is this truth? Or am I pattern matching and filling in the blanks based on my own lived experiences and how those show up in my lives? And that can be incredibly difficult to do, but is often very well supported with, I'm saying this so carefully, various plant-based medicines. And that's what I have to say about that.
Oh, that was beautifully said. And I think it makes a lot of sense. What you said earlier about your anxiety, not knowing that everybody felt that way. I had a very similar experience. I lived, 20 years of my life thinking my brain was normal. This is how everybody feels. Just deal with it. And then when I started getting high, it gave me that space to step back and say, holy crap, no, it's not.
Mm-hmm. And in particular, racing thoughts and intrusive thoughts are things that a lot of neurodivergent people can struggle with, especially when you sort of add on that extra moment of like, and now I'm hyper fixating on the intrusive thoughts, and it's making that cycle even worse. And so again, that sort of being able to slow down those thoughts, to like slow down one's brain and say, okay, like let's actually sort of one step at a time, very thoughtfully, very intentionally work through these sort of thought spirals that I'm going through. And it can be an incredibly powerful experience to like do that for the first time and realize how often our perception of rejection or, oh my God, everybody is laughing at me and they think that I'm dumb and bad and stupid and terrible at everything is no, no, that's just your brain. It's your brain. Your brain's just trying to do its job.
Yeah.
And it's working really, really hard. But sometimes, slowing it down a little bit helps.
Yeah,
sometimes it works too hard.
Right?
I tried to get diagnosed officially when I was 27. And I told the doctor that I smoked weed. And they're like, how do you think that you can function? I was in law school at the time. They're like, how do you think that you can function? That, there's no way that you can do that. And I was trying to explain to them this concept of like, it's slowing things down, right? It's quieting some things in the back and it's allowing me to feel present and in my chair and not uncomfortable by my chair at the same time with like some kind of sensory issue that might come up with it, right? Like it's a really great tool to be able to slow down things.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really easy, especially when we're talking about ADHD, which is like a very sort of common neurodivergence. But it's really easy to sort of relegate ADHD to, oh, it's just a thing that makes me disorganized, or, oh, it's just a thing that makes me bad at school or whatever. But the reality is that because ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder, that means you are born with it. That means that you have it your whole life. And there will be periods of time in which it gets better and worse. And those are often in flux and based a lot on environmental and social happenings in your world. But even more than that, it is something that affects every moment of every day. And when you start to look at the comorbidities, it's literally from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep. And there are so many different comorbidities, and there are so many different ways that it shows up, and different ways that it can affect you. One of the things that can be incredibly useful and often very vulnerable, very challenging, very difficult, it can feel a little scary, but is to really examine those moments in your life and say, where am I struggling? Where am I struggling? Where am I succeeding? Where am I successful? What are my, weaknesses, but also what are my strengths? And finding ways to support those weaknesses by sort of taking hold of your strength and working to magnify that. That is such a powerful way of navigating neurodiversity that doesn't necessarily come from it's a superpower mindset, but it also doesn't come from it's a, terrible affliction that I'm cursed with. And I think things like cannabis and THC and just generally non-traditional medication can be an incredibly powerful tool, but that tool, I think it's really important to say, has to come with that introspection and that sort of evaluation of strengths and weaknesses and experimentation and finding what works and what doesn't work for you. And if you don't figure that out the first time, it's okay. You don't figure it out the second time, it's okay. Because neurodivergence is lifelong and it is a learning process constantly.
But it is a tool. And, you can use a hammer to build a house. You can use a hammer to kill people. THC can enhance your life. THC can really hurt your life if you allow it to, allow
absolutely.
it to take film. So it really is about that intention, that knowledge, that skill that you're using it with.
Yeah. Well, and thank you both, honestly, because you all are contributing to that education and you're contributing to that very, I think, sort of moderate, like, hey, you really need to understand the difference between, sun grown and not in order to really contextualize like how this might be a tool. It's not about just like go out there and smoke drugs, kids. Like it's really based in education and research and responsible usage. And I really appreciate that you're doing that. And that's really important work. So thank you.